Welcome, 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 everybody. We'll just give it another minute or two while people join, but we're so delighted everybody's here today. Thank you for being here. Terrific. Well, welcome to Civil Disagreement, Reproduction and Abortion in America. I'm Danielle Allen, Director of the Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Ethics, and it's just a huge pleasure and privilege to welcome you all here this evening. We're super proud of this program. In 2019, the Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University started a new series of moderated civil disagreement discussions to bring together policy and subject experts who hold different political viewpoints on urgent current events. Our goal has been to model thoughtful, reflective engagement on hard issues with the firm belief that we have much more to learn from opposing views and perspectives than anything else. Today's entry in the series is on the controversial subject of abortion and reproduction in America. The aim of the conversation is to understand better the panelists' different positions on these issues, as well as the experiences, beliefs, and values that animate their positions. We'd like to extend a special welcome to our Intercollegiate Civil Disagreement Partnership, or ICDP Fellows. These ICDP Fellows are participating from California State University, Bakersfield, Harvard, Santa Fe College in Gainesville, Florida, Stanford University, and St. Philip's College in San Antonio, Texas. It's great to have the whole country in one Zoom room today. We're so grateful. The Intercollegiate Civil Disagreement Partnership Program is committed to advancing fundamental democratic commitments to freedom of expression, equality, and agency. For the full academic year, these fellows work together across their 5 campuses at building their skills at having hard conversations and learning how to facilitate those discussions for others. The ICDP Fellows convene in their own small group conversations. We'll do so tomorrow to dive deeper into the issues that today's discussion will elicit. I am now pleased to introduce my colleague and friend, wonderful co-conspirator and collaborator on so many things, Jane Kamensky. Jane is a truly special person. You're lucky to be in her hands tonight. Jane is the Jonathan Trumbull Professor of American History at Harvard University and the Pforzheimer Foundation Director of the Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America. She is the author of remarkable books in American history, both early American history, revolutionary history, and contemporary 20th century history, ranging across all kinds of topics, from art to sexuality, experience of women, politics, the American Revolution. She is broad-ranging indeed. Jane will introduce our panelists and serve as our moderator for this event. Before I turn the floor over to Jane, though, a few things to note. We strongly encourage you to enter questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Just put them in whenever they occur to you. No need to wait until the end to do so, and we'll get to as many of the questions as we possibly can. We have an ASL interpreter here today, actually 2. You'll be able to see them now, and they'll be switching off as well. We also have closed captions available via a second screen at the link that we'll post in the chat. If you have any problems with either of these assistive measures, please let us know via the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to help resolve them. We'd also like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Teresa Blankmeyer-Burke and her moral philosophy class. Thank you for being here. We're glad to have you with us. And with that, Jane, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I'm always happy to conspire with you, and thrilled to be here for this event on behalf of the Safra Center and its Intercollegiate Civil Disagreement Program this afternoon. Harvard's motto is veritas, or truth, and you can't find truth without being willing to encounter rigorously people who disagree with you. And I'm so thrilled that we have a panel of both impassioned and compassionate experts who are willing to take that posture around what I think is perhaps the hardest issue in American public life, a literally existential issue on which we seek to model our differences and our ability to learn from and to collaborate with each other. The ICDP's principle of listening to understand rather than arguing to persuade. It would be a bad outcome for this group to have a kind of false consensus emerge among us. And so we have pre-planned to talk right into places where we get stuck and where we disagree with each other. It would also be a bad outcome to have a conversation among people who disagree dissolve into ad personam attack. And we want to show our audience and work with our students to understand that there is a wide range of options available to us as serious interlocutors on serious issues. So we may at some points break the fourth wall and talk about the moves that we're making in order to facilitate conversation across chasms of difference on an existential issue. So without further ado, I'm going to give very brief introductions to our panelists, about whom you can find out more through the link in the chat and on the Safra Center's website. And then I'm going to ask them all to reintroduce themselves with respect to the issue before us today. I'll start by welcoming Kimberly Mutcherson, professor of law and co-dean of the Rutgers Law School, an eminent scholar of reproductive justice, whose work has focused on assisted reproduction, abortion, disability, and medical decision-making for pregnant women and for children. Then I will welcome Daniel K. Williams, who is professor of history at the University of West Georgia, where his scholarship focuses on the intersections between politics and religion in modern America. And among his excellent books is Defenders of the Unborn, I think widely respected as the most nuanced, rigorous, and empathic history of the pro-life movement in its early years before Roe. Next, we will welcome into the conversation Monica Sparks, who is a small business owner and family woman and servant leader as an elected official, the county commissioner from Kent County, Michigan. Her run as a Democrat for that office was endorsed by the Sierra Club and the Right to Life PAC, which shows you something of the complexity of positions and advocacy that Commissioner Sparks holds. And last but not least is Reverend Rob Schenck, a theologian and longtime pro-life activist who is most recently the founder of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute in Washington, named after the brave German anti-Nazi upstander and modeling the moral posture that Reverend Schenck is looking to have on complicated issues in today's political environment. And after introducing you all formally, if it's okay, let's all call each other by our first names for the sake of the session. So what I would like next is for the audience to hear from each of you in that order: Kim, Dan, Monica, and Rob, reintroducing yourselves by locating your work around abortion and reproduction. How did you come to hold the stance you have? Is there a label that you put on yourself with respect to the issue on the table today? Or do you refuse labels? And if so, why? Who are your key audiences in this work? And Kim, if you can start it off and then pass the baton to Dan and so on.
Perfect. So Juan, thank you for having me here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. And so when we did our sort of practice round for this event, we talked about these intros being about 3 minutes. So I'm going to really do my best to stay within that number. So I am obviously a law professor. I am also somebody who teaches bioethics. So I think about these issues both from a legal standpoint and from a bioethics standpoint. I think the most important thing for me to say as somebody who identifies both as pro-choice and also I would say pro-abortion, and I'm happy to talk about that later on in our conversation. Jane introduced me as a reproductive justice scholar, and I think it's really important for me to describe what that means, because when I'm talking about abortion, I'm never just talking about abortion. So reproductive justice is a movement that was started by Black women in the mid-90s. And these were women who were activists in their communities across a whole host of issues, including reproductive rights issues. And they became ultimately very frustrated with mainstream reproductive rights organizations, which were very focused on abortion, very focused on choice within the context of abortion, and weren't necessarily thinking about or talking about a whole range of reproductive oppression issues that were important for Black women and other women of color. So there are three central tenets to reproductive justice. The first is a human right for every woman to decide if she wants to have a baby. The second is a human right to decide if you don't want to have a baby and to have the tools necessary to either not become pregnant or to terminate a pregnancy. And then the third one, and this is the one that I find particularly important, the third tenet is once you have a child, to be able to raise that child in safe and healthy environments without fear of violence. So I think it's important for me to put that on the table, one, because reproductive justice and reproductive rights are not synonymous. So I am not a reproductive rights person, I'm a reproductive justice person. And two, because again, when I talk about abortion, I'm never just talking about abortion. I'm thinking about all the issues that surround when, why, and how somebody decides to terminate a pregnancy. So I'll stop there. And now it's Dan's turn.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks, Kim, and thanks, Jane, for inviting me to be part of this panel. I am a historian, and historians, I think, try to understand people, try to understand where people are coming from, try to understand other viewpoints. And I'm particularly interested in this question of why we arrive at particular views on controversial questions. So as Jane mentioned, about 6 years ago, I published Defenders of the Unborn, the pro-life movement before Roe v. Wade, which looks at a complicated moment in American history when people were rethinking abortion laws. And one particular group of people decided that there was reason to preserve laws against abortion. So I was intrigued to study this group. Actually, I got into this research because of an earlier book that I had written called God's Own Party, which was about the alliance between evangelical Protestants and the Republican Party that formed the Christian right. And I realized based on that, the research that I did for that book, that the abortion issue is a little bit different than any other similar moral issue in American politics. So if you look at issues of LGBTQ rights, you can plot a fairly linear trajectory, not completely linear, but a fairly linear trajectory toward a generally more progressive consensus in the United States. On school prayer, you can also plot a trajectory of increasing acceptance of secular thinking about the place of religion, if any, in public education. But on abortion, as we know very well from this year, there is not a movement toward consensus, at least not on the surface. And so I wanted to examine that. And what I determined in Defenders of the Unborn is that abortion is really about two competing human rights claims. And some of the people who initially opposed abortion were coming at this issue from the political left, that the alliance between the pro-life movement and the political right is a relatively recent alliance in the history of the abortion debate. So I found that intriguing. I wanted to write about it, and I will probably return to the abortion issue in a future book project that will look at this a little bit more broadly about the relationship between religious viewpoints and abortion views on all sides of the political spectrum. In terms of my personal beliefs, I should say that I have approached this issue primarily as a historian, which means I have the luxury of distancing myself a little bit from the controversy. But I've also done some writing where I identify my personal views. And I identify as pro-life with an asterisk. I would say that there's a lot in the modern pro-life movement that I don't necessarily support, including its alliance with the political right, its Supreme Court judicial strategy, and a number of other things. I would strongly affirm the third point that Ken mentioned about wanting to, as a society, make sure that every person who has a child can raise that child in safety. So I think there are some shared goals. There are obviously also some differences, and I'm looking forward to talking about some of those differences.
Hi there, everyone. I'm really excited to be here, and I definitely knew you were a historian, Dan, with all of those bazillion books behind you. So thank you so much for having me. I'm Monica Sparks, and I identify as a whole life Democrat. So there are more than 1 in 3 Democrats that are pro-life. So 20 million Democrats, but you're not going to hear about us. You're not going to hear about us in the mainstream. Why? Because it's not sexy, because the party doesn't want you to necessarily know about us. Why? Because they're busy getting money from these other organizations that fund them and give very big checks. So there are a lot of people that are Democrats that are on the same page as I am. You mentioned earlier that I was endorsed by Right to Life. And yes, there are 8 of us Democrats here on this side of the state in Michigan that are endorsed by Right to Life. It's not a black and white issue. It's not a yes or no. And I really appreciated what you said earlier. The first lady that spoke earlier when she said, when you're talking about abortion, you're not just talking about abortion. There's so many things that are encompassing and surrounding the whole topic. So when I look at myself, I don't mind labeling myself as a pro-life. I call myself a whole life Democrat. And the reason why is because I'm looking from the womb to the tomb. How can we be supported? How can we support women so that they can make those decisions to have children if they want to? How can we make sure that they're fully supported? As you guys know, it's almost easier to not have children. You get more money, you get more tax breaks, you get more of everything when you're not trying to have a family, when you're not trying to do what your body like normally physically is able to do. So I get very frustrated with with our government. I get frustrated with our media. And I think that at the end of the day, I'm wearing the label because you have to. In politics, how many independents do you know are out there that have won? I align more with the Democrats than I do with the Republicans. However, I have an identical twin sister, and she's a Republican. And guess what? She's also an elected official as well. So, and we live in the same town. So how does that happen when you have 2 different people that were raised in the same household, but yet we still have our own various political beliefs? And how does it bear for you that we're still both in politics in the same city in different parties, and we're both still thriving? So I think that people are more concerned about people, and abortion is such a personal issue that they don't want to wear it as a badge of honor. So I'll stop right now so that someone else can go. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here.
Monica, it's nice to follow you because I also have an identical twin.
Yay, twinsies.
So I know what that life experience is like. Although he and I are more aligned, the difference between us is I'm a Protestant evangelical minister. He's a Roman Catholic priest. So that makes an interesting conversation. I struggle with how to identify vis-a-vis this question. The best I can do now is to describe myself as a pro-choice, pro-lifer. And there's a few reasons for that, but first let me just give you a little background, I spent 30 plus years as a leader in a particularly aggressive wing of the pro-life, anti-abortion movement. It's mostly mostly associated with the moniker Operation Rescue, but there were various permutations and iterations of it. I was most closely aligned with a group called Western New York Rescue. It was a component of the national movement. And that meant I spent those years blockading clinics, organizing large-scale blockades, including some that drew thousands of people. We engaged in public displays of fetal remains in faux funerals. Some may remember an incident where several people, including myself, were arrested for displaying fetal remains to then Governor Bill Clinton when he was the presumptive presidential candidate for the 1992 Democratic National Convention. And that took me to Washington, D.C. in 1994, where I then kind of switched from sidewalk activism to internal advocacy, working inside of government, meeting with elected and appointed officials in Congress, in White Houses, and eventually Supreme Court justices, meeting privately with them. It was a religious and moral campaign that I was largely successful. I would say it played some role in bringing about the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe. That was always our overarching objective, was to see the reversal of Roe v. Wade. I now regret much of that, not all of it. I know, some folks are wincing right now and maybe saying a little too late. I'll explain that change quickly. At age 52, I took a leave of absence from the movement. I was concerned about its over-politicization. It started as a moral and religious cause for me. It became a highly politicized one. And during that time, I undertook a late-in-life doctoral program, something I had put off for way too long. And in my research, I looked at the parallels between my evangelical church here in the United States and attendant culture, and compared it to the evangelical church in Germany during the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazism. And I was startled at the parallels between the two. And coming out of that, I reflected on a few experiences I had that I had put on a mental shelf into me and challenged all of my assumptions and presumptions and my certitude when it came to this question. And one in particular, when I was arrested for my protest work in Montgomery, Alabama, because the jail was overcrowded, they put me on the psychiatric wing, which meant it was a co-ed men and women on the same wing of the jail. And a few cell down from mine, an African-American woman who was deeply distraught was screaming the entire time I was there, a whole 24-hour period. And she almost never paused from yelling and shrieking and begging for someone to come to the aid of children. Where are my babies? Who's taking care of my babies? I've got 3 kids. Who got my kids? Where are my kids? It's hard for me to recount this story. It was so deeply troubling at the time. And I heard that and realized that in the imaginary bubble that I had created.
Oh, I think Rob was having audio difficulties and looks like the call got dropped. So let's continue as he rejoins us. I want to follow all your opening statements and especially Rob's narrative of a remarkable a kind of conversion experience here, and ask your co-panelists, Rob, and I'll start in the same order with Kim and then Dan and then Monica. Have you changed your mind? And if so, what's your catalyst here? Having had you each underline that we're talking about an issue, in Dan's words, that's different from any other, that talking about abortion is never just talking about abortion, from Kim, and that it's not a black or white yes or no from Monica. So are there places where you've changed your minds, and do you seek to change minds? Is that a goal?
So I went to my first abortion rights march when I was in high school. And so I have not changed my mind in that sense. It's something that I've been deeply committed to for a very long time. I will say, I think that one of the things that has been really powerful for me in thinking about being a person who is pro-choice is being pregnant twice and having 2 children, and really thinking about, 1, not everybody likes being pregnant. 2, not everybody wants to be pregnant. 3, pregnancy can kill you, right? Even in this country, we have the highest maternal mortality rate of any developed nation. But 4, really thinking about how awful, at least from my perspective, how awful it would be to have your body consumed in that way if you didn't want that to be happening, right? I mean, pregnancy is 24/7 for 9 months. You know, my feet grew half a size. I mean, it was just extraordinary what it does to your body. And so having had 2 children, I think if anything has actually made me more pro-choice than I was before I had children. On the question of whether I want to change people's minds, you know, not necessarily. You know, what I say all the time is, if somebody is deeply committed to and believes very deeply that a fetus at 6 weeks is no different than a 6-year-old, we're just not going to have a lot to talk about, right? The chasm there is really substantial. But I don't think that most people live on those 2 ends. The world is complicated. People's lives are complicated. The choices that we get to make, not just the choices that we make, the choices that we get to make, right? Because every choice is made within some different set of constraints. And so for me, you know, what I really want is to be able to have conversations with people who recognize the nuance, who recognize the pain sometimes in these conversations, who recognize how critical it is for people, whether they are women, men, trans, young, old, whatever, to be able to have control over their lives in very particular ways. So that's where I land.
Thank you. Welcome back, Rob and Dan.
Yeah. Well, I have not had any dramatic conversions on the issue in the way that maybe Rob did. I'm not sure anyone is going to be able to top that story that he shared. I would say, though, that I've always been in the process of rethinking things ever since I began seriously studying this issue a number of years ago. So my own background is that I grew up in a very conservative evangelical Christian home. I emerged as a young adult with strongly pro-life beliefs that I thought were eminently defensible through reason. But as a young adult, I didn't necessarily do a whole lot in response to those beliefs. So, I was focused kind of on other issues that I was studying. But I think that background informed the way that I approached the issue when I did begin studying it. By that point, I had had a lot of experiences in very pluralistic, very politically progressive environments, going through a PhD program at Brown, beginning my work in the profession. But I think when I started researching defenders of the unborn, what I was struck by is perhaps the beauty of the original pro-life movement's theology and consistent approach to issues of life, which was something that I had not seen necessarily growing up. And I was struck by the differences between the early pro-life movement and the pro-life movement that I was more familiar with in modern politically conservative contexts. And so I was drawn to that earlier pro-life movement in terms of its philosophical defenses of life. And I would say that I wrote Defenders of the Unborn not primarily to persuade, but partly to persuade. I was telling a story that I didn't think would make people pro-life, but if they were not. But I was hoping that it would make people more sympathetic, perhaps, to the original goals of the pro-life movement, even if they came away with some profound disagreements with those goals. That I think there's a certain beauty to the concern about life that maybe could be considered marginalized or easy to overlook, that motivated people who were concerned about what implications this might have for society as a whole in terms of larger issues. In recent years, though, I've had to do some rethinking once again. I published that book in January. Well, it came out in January 2016, so I finalized it in the summer of 2015. And a lot has happened since January 2016, as we know. And so I would say that some of my more recent writing has been to caution the pro-life movement about what I perceived as the dangers of some of the politically cynical bargains that they were trying to make in order to make abortion illegal in certain places. And I think even in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, I had predicted in May in a series of articles that I wrote right before the decision was released, but after the leak, what I thought would be the result of the decision. And I said at most, we would probably see a reduction in the abortion rate of about 15%, and that was at most. And the New York Times estimate is that it's been a reduction of about 6%. So I think with some justification, I saw that maybe the strategy of just trying to make abortion illegal is not a particularly effective strategy in reducing the abortion rate overall. You can reduce the abortion rate a little bit with abortion bans, but the question is that is that necessarily the most productive way for the pro-life movement to go forward? And that's kind of a new way of thinking about the issue for me. I had not necessarily thought about it in those ways with the Defenders of the Unborn, but we're at a different political moment. And so I think as we see different laws being passed, different effects that maybe people hadn't foreseen, like the question of what about women who are experiencing miscarriages, trying to get emergency room treatment, those questions have to be asked. Now, I wouldn't say that I've become pro-choice. I'm still deeply pro-life in terms of my personal beliefs, my philosophy. And I would say that I see the logic of what the pro-life movement was trying to do in terms of translating their beliefs into public law. But I do think that I'm much more cautious than I once was, perhaps, in thinking about how those beliefs can be translated.
Monica?
Thank you so much. I am not at the point where I try to change anyone's mind. I present the facts, I lay the facts out, and people have to make their own decisions. I'm not the judge and jury on whether someone has, an abortion. I'm thinking about the life. I am thinking that abortion is rooted in racism. We've seen how it started with Margaret Sanger, rooted in racism to erase the feeble-minded, the weak and feeble people, which were African Americans, which were Latinos, which were people of color. So how something starts, a lot of times is how it always ends. And when you look at some of the things that we were already going through, the racism, in this country that still prevails and still exists today. I can't personally see how getting rid of people of color, genocide, depopulation, how that's going to help in the grand scheme of things. But I don't want my race exterminated. I don't feel that, having marginalized or treating us as, marginalized individuals is productive at all. Blacks have made many, many accomplishments and have given many great things and added many great things, as well as people who are other people of color, great things to our US culture. So when I look at, abortion, I don't try to change someone's mind. It's not for me to change. I am an American and I appreciate having my democracy. And so I share that same belief. And guess what? I respect the thoughts and process of other people, because if everyone thought like me, this world would be super duper boring. And if everyone thought, the same as their party, none of us agree with 100% with our parties. You can't tell me that every move that your party makes, you're going to go along with it. No, you don't. So I just think that for me personally, I was not supposed to be here. I was in the foster care system. My twin sister and I were taken from our mom at the age of 4. So no, it was not that I was a baby and I couldn't remember. I can tell you the day and time when the state came, when they took us from our mom, because she couldn't take care of us. She was heroin addicted. And I remember, going to the different foster care homes. And what's really funny is people try to use it as an argument. Yeah, let's just, make life a lot easier if we didn't have these children. Well, today I passed a budget that gave a brand new CDFI for African Americans and for the Latino community. But if I was aborted, I couldn't do that. I wouldn't be here. And it's funny, all the people talking about abortion are already born. They're already here. But what about the life? Who are we to say that someone deserves to be here and someone doesn't deserve to be here? And then it lets our government off the hook when we don't make them accountable to take care of the citizens that live here. It's just wrong, in my opinion. This is my opinion, and everybody can have their own, but it's just wrong. So I don't believe I'll be changing my mind anytime soon. And as far as what's her name, Professor Jean, the dean?
Danielle Allen.
Okay, Professor Allen. Yeah. I appreciate what you bring to the table. And you taught me something, actually. I didn't know that there was a whole group of women about that. So thank you for sharing that information with me. So see, I learned something today, but it's not going to change my mind. And I don't want to change anyone else's mind. I just want to be able to share the information. So thank you.
Kim, I'm going to ask if you will jump in on the question of race and disparities, since I know that that's something that you also care deeply about and work on and from a different direction.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Jade. And thank you so much for what you shared as well, Monica. So, I think that there are a lot of complicated pieces here when it comes to race. And I have certainly been disturbed by some of the anti-choice rhetoric around abortion, right? I remember the billboards that were up at one point that said the most dangerous place for a Black child is in his mother's womb. which I think is really problematic in terms of talking about Black women. So I don't accept that. But I also think just in terms of the history, abortion didn't start with Margaret Sanger, right? Women have been finding ways to not become pregnant and to end pregnancies and to bring their period back, right? There are deep traditions both in African societies and also in Black American societies. So, you know, the idea that abortion is this thing that exists because it has been sort of foisted on Black communities by white people, I think deprives us of our agency. It deprives us of our ability to be decision makers, and particularly Black women to be decision makers, and to be able to recognize this is what I can handle and this is what I can't handle. The other thing I'll say on this sort of genocidal claim, you know, the vast majority of women, about 60% of women who have abortions in this country already have children at home. Right? These are decisions that are being made about what can I handle, what's the right family size, you know, all these other sorts of things. So, you know, I agree with you that there are lots of things that we should be thinking about in terms of supporting families and supporting communities and supporting Black folks when they do decide to have children. But I also think that it's really important for people to be able to determine their life course, and being able to decide when or if you have a child, with whom you have a child, is part of being able to decide your life course.
Thanks, Kim. And I want to go back to something that's implicit in several of the comments so far that that Dan articulated earlier. Dan said that we're talking in this space about two competing human rights claims. And I think we need to get on the table. So we've talked about women's lives to a degree. Let's get the question of fetal personhood on the table. Is a fetus a person? And whether a fetus is or isn't a person, what are our obligations to value fetal life? Do we have an obligation to value fetal life? And Rob, I'd like to bring you back in, then Dan, then Monica, then Kim. Rob, you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry about that, folks. For me, the question begins with what is personhood? What do we mean by that? Part of my change in my position and approach to the question of abortion had to do with seeing the personhood of the woman who is carrying that pregnancy, which was something I thought that I appreciated. I gave some acknowledgement to, but I came to see the depth, the profundity of what it is for an individual to have dignity, to have autonomy, to have agency, to appreciate that individual's reality. The pro-life movement I was a part of, and I know there are, of course, many different branches of the movement. But what the pregnant woman became was a
Rob, I am sorry for your connectivity issues. Dan, can you jump in on this question of fetal personhood? So Rob has given us female personhood. What's the second grade there?
Yeah, so I think the way that Rob was defining personhood is very similar to the way that I've seen liberal or mainline Protestants who identified with the pro-choice movement, at least reluctantly, if not enthusiastically, define personhood in the early 1970s when this issue was being debated right before Roe. And I think probably would define it in the same way today, though I've seen the most writing on it from about 50 years ago. And that is to define personhood in terms of some of its qualities of autonomy, relationships with others. The pro-life movement has resisted those particular definitions of personhood. And the standard argument that the pro-life movement would give in regard to personhood is that any definition of personhood that is not rooted in the biological fact of human life, that is, I think regardless of your position on abortion, most people would agree that the zygote or embryo, or certainly fetus at all those stages, has a DNA that is human and that is a separate DNA from its parent. Those are just basic scientific facts. And then the question is, what do you do with that information? But the pro-life movement's argument would be, if this is indeed human life, then human personhood cannot be separated from human life. That is, if it's a human individual, if it is a human life that has a unique DNA and that is living, then we are on dangerous ground if we then say that that's not a person. And I find that argument persuasive. I think that there are some problematic aspects that this does get into, particularly when you try to say, well, does an embryo have the same rights as a child, as a born child or an adult person? We start to get into some real complications, and most Americans, as Kim correctly pointed out, are not willing to go there. So the pro-life movement has the advantage of making what I would consider a philosophically consistent argument, but it does happen to be an argument that, depending on how you ask the question, perhaps as many as 90% of Americans don't fully share. So I would grant that. But there is some beauty in the argument, in the sense that any other definition of personhood is, one, going to appear to be somewhat arbitrary, and two, is going to potentially undercut the rights of some other group of people that we would consider people. So, for example, if we define human life by its independence, its autonomy, saying it's not until birth that we really can talk about personhood, well, a lot of Americans, in fact, the majority, according to public opinion polls, are going to have a real problem with aborting 7 or 8 month fetuses in most cases. Furthermore, at the extreme end of disabilities or end of life care, we have people that are very dependent, not very autonomous. And so if autonomy becomes the basis for personhood, that can lead to problems. Similarly, with every other quality that we can envision as a definition for personhood, at some point, we're going to get into some philosophical quandaries. And so the pro-life movement has I think its philosophical advantage here, saying we're going to protect all human life, including the human life that seems most undeveloped, most marginalized, most dependent, even that is valuable. So I would start there and say that's a serious argument. Now, it may not be a conclusive argument. I do think, we have to start talking about, if it were to stand on its own, I think it would have great persuasive power. What the reproductive rights movement has tended to counter that with is, well, what about the rights of the woman? And it's fine to talk about protecting marginalized life, but if the marginalized life is going to be protected at the expense of someone we can all agree is a person, and if it's going to diminish that person's personhood, as they would argue, then there's a real problem. And I do think the pro-life movement, has to take that argument seriously. The way they usually respond to that argument is by talking about interdependence, by suggesting that the competing rights are less competitive than maybe Kim phrased it a few minutes ago. That is, that pregnancy, while we all can agree there are there are pregnancies that are real crisis pregnancies from a medical and psychological standpoint and every other standpoint. But nevertheless, the pro-life movement is going to try to minimize aspect of thinking of pregnancy as a crisis, or as something that should only be entered into with sort of a fully chosen position. They would tend to see a biological, an inseparable biological interdependence between the mother and child. And I think Monica was getting at this a few minutes ago when she was talking about this. And I know there was a questioner who pushed back against that, and we can talk about that. But that is the way the pro-life movement would think about this, as they would start from the standpoint of saying personhood should not be separated from biological human life. And they would also look at interdependent relationships and would say that we shouldn't think of personhood in a purely Lockean sense of the individual as a fully autonomous being, that there's actually a relationship between human persons that's part of what defines us as people.
Thanks, Dan. And Monica, is a fetus a person, and what do we do with that?
Okay, so we want to go straight to fetus, or do we want to start with the blastocyst, then go to the embryo, then go to the fetus, then go to the baby, then go to the child, then the preteen, the teenager, the adult, the senior? All of that is a human being, period. All of those stages are stages of being a human being.
Kim, over to you.
So in my introduction, I said that I also am a bioethics person, and I teach a class at my law school called Bioethics, Babies and Baby Making, which is hugely fun to teach. And we start with a unit that is on personhood and abortion. And so I have had hundreds and hundreds of conversations with students about what does it mean to be a person? What do we owe to people? Creating lists of characteristics of personhood. And it's a fun exercise, right? But I think what's really important here is that answering the personhood question doesn't answer the abortion question. That's what I think is really critical, right? So you could say that a fetus is a person, but that doesn't tell me whether I then have an obligation to keep that person alive. So, the example that I give to my students is the piece by Judith Jarvis Thompson, very famous philosopher. And she has this great piece where she says, you're walking down the street one day, you're just minding your business. All of a sudden you wake up the next day, you're in the hospital, and you have been hooked up to this world famous violinist, and you are keeping that person alive, right? No argument about fetus or anything. This is just another person. And then the question is, what is your obligation to stay in that hospital and to stay hooked up to that violinist in order to sustain that person's life, right? And so when you sort of think about these issues, it's not just about, well, here's life, and so therefore everybody is obligated to do all things in order to sustain this life. It's a much more complicated query. And even as we start to think about the responsibilities of parenthood, if I have two children at home, if one of my children needed a kidney, or even if one of my children needed a blood transfusion, and I was the only person in the world who could give that blood transfusion or give that kidney, our legal system would not require me to do that, right? We could have all kinds of systems in place that could save thousands and thousands of lives in this country if we were willing to require people to sustain the lives of other people. And we don't do that. So the question for me isn't about necessarily who's a person or who's not a person, because I don't think that really answers what we're trying to achieve here, right? Because ultimately what we're asking is, what responsibility does anybody have to sustain or to protect somebody else's life?
Thank you all. And let me just point out to the panel and to listeners, Rob is on the call. He has turned video off to preserve limited bandwidth. I think just as timekeeper, we have time to do one more round robin among us, and then pivot to audience questions. Audience members, please do put questions in the chat, which will make their way through to us. I want to go in reverse order. So Kim, then Monica, then Dan, then Rob. Am I right that that's reverse, or have I screwed it up? And ask, and this picks up on something that that Kim said in her introduction. She said she's pro-abortion, not just pro-choice. Can abortion be a good decision? And tell us how you're defining the good in your answer to that question.
Yeah, so I'll go back to what I said just not so long ago, which is, women have been finding ways to avoid pregnancy and to terminate pregnancies for centuries, right? And what that says to me is that there are a very wide range of reasons why somebody would choose not to get pregnant or not to remain pregnant. And I think that's really important, right? I do not start from the belief that, we are put on this earth to make babies, or that it is, the sort of greatest gift that a woman can do is to become a mother. That's just, it's just not something that I believe. There are all sorts of ways in which people want to organize and choose to organize their lives. And so, when I think about pregnancy and I think about the impact that pregnancy has on people's lives, I say that I'm pro-abortion because I believe that abortion is a good thing, right? It provides an opportunity for people to control their reproductive lives. And that's a really important thing to be able to do. Obviously, on the extremes, it's important if you have a pregnancy that risks your life, right? I don't think that you should have to die in order to give birth to a child. But I also believe on the very far end of that somebody who ends up pregnant and who doesn't want to be pregnant, right? Whether it's because it's not the right time in your life, whether it's because the person who is the father of that child is somebody who you do not want to be yoked to, right? Which is what happens when you have a child with somebody, whether it's because you are living in poverty and you're trying to get yourself out of poverty, and having another child makes that more difficult. And we know that all of these things are realities. So if you're interested in sort of knowing what happens to people when they don't get access to abortion, there's the Turnaway study that was done many years ago, and it's being updated now. And we know that when a person wants an abortion and doesn't get it, you end up staying in a violent relationship. You end up not being able to finish that educational program. You end up staying in poverty. So there are lots of impacts there. And from my perspective, because abortion is not neutral, because pregnancy is not neutral, right? Pregnancy has consequences. Even the easiest pregnancy has consequences. I want to live in a world where people get to actually decide whether they want to be pregnant and whether they want to give birth to a child. And the last thing that I'll say about that, one of the things that I found most problematic about the oral argument in Dobbs was Justice Barrett, who basically said, well, it's not such a big deal to be pregnant because you can just, have the baby and then drop them off, at a fire station, right? Through safe haven laws. And so pregnancy is not such a big deal anymore. And I think that is such a incredibly simplistic way of thinking about people's lives, thinking about human rights, thinking about autonomy. And I'll go back to what I said before. These are nuanced and complicated issues. And if we try to flatten them out, I think we're never going to get to a really good answer, right? Because there's nothing about this that is simple. It's always complex.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I agree that I know we're supposed to be disagreeing, but it is a complex issue. It is never, ever going to be a black and a white. And that's the one thing that I get very discouraged with conversations, that people want you to just answer quickly. They just want you to put an answer on it. Is it a yes or no? Then they come back, well, what about rape or incest? Well, I never would expect anyone to have to carry that torch. I would never think that would be fair, even for someone to have to live with that reminder of that negativity that happened, to them. And even studies show you that when you are accepting some of these things into your body that cause cancer, they cause other illnesses. So that, and I would not be surprised if that's why we have so many different, illnesses, because there is a long history of, rape, trauma, incest, all throughout our culture. So just thinking about the black and the white issue, it doesn't make any sense. Having these kind of conversations where I'm able to hear a different point of view, and another point of view, and maybe the same point of view, and then I'm able to take that information back to my heart, because I feel like this is an issue of the heart. I don't even almost feel like this is an issue of, just where the mainstream media is trying to, score some points, because it's emotional. And media knows that when you can invoke emotion, that's where you got them. That's where, they get the ratings from. So when I look at the head and the heart thing, then I'm also going back to, I don't believe there's any woman that wakes up and says, I just want to kill my baby today. I don't believe that. I believe that they do it out of fear. They do it because they're in poverty. They do it because they don't see a way out. They don't see a future between them and the child that they're carrying. So I don't feel that, putting a label on them as far as being criminals is right, because that's not going to also move us to further at all. That's also going to put us behind. So how do we make sure that people that want to have children, everyone's not doesn't want to be a mother, and that's fine. Everyone doesn't have to be a mother. Everyone doesn't have to be a father. But how do we make sure that we can support those that do want to have children? Or guess what? How can we support people in contraceptive methods if that's what they want to do as well? So we need to educate people.
Thank you. And Dan, can I bring Rob back in, just because he's languishing in darkness here. We can't see him. And Rob, I'd love to have you finish your thought about personhood, and then quickly, so we can get to audience questions, we'll ask you and Dan to answer whether abortion can be good.
Sure. Well, just in case, let me see. Just in case I drop out again, I did try to type with my thumbs on the screen here. I'm on backup technology. It's been very frustrating where I am. I didn't expect to be in the location I'm in, so I'm doing the best. So my apologies to everyone. Quickly, where I was going with the question of personhood was that, for me, that question doesn't end with autonomy. It does end with the individual who is closest to this experience, who knows it most intimately. Frankly, I feel a little badly weighing in here, because as a man, as a male, I will never know this subject, this topic, this experience in the way a woman does. I will never know that. If maybe in the mid to distant future I can, then maybe I can enter more fully into the conversation. But at 64, I don't have a lot of hope I'll get that opportunity. I think it's still quite a ways away. So first, I think part of respecting the personhood of the woman and her dignity is the fact that a woman knows this question in a way a man can never know it, cannot know it. And that has to do with reality. And one of my revelations as a national pro-life movement leader and clergy person was suddenly, call it a keen sense of the obvious, but I realized that what I was doing in my pro-life imagination was requiring women to leave their reality and enter my fantasy. And I came to the realization that my role, if I had one at all, was to leave my fantasy, my realization of what it means to be pro-life and enter that woman's reality and walk alongside and honor her experience, which is an experience I cannot know. And that's why I've come to the conclusion that it is that pregnant woman ultimately. I may think she doesn't have all the tools she needs. I wish she knew something more. Maybe I could bring something. Maybe if she invites me to, I would offer, but only if I was invited to bring maybe my opinion or perspective. But failing that, I have to respect her humanity and dignity in making that ultimate decision. For me, when I was with my dying father in a nursing home who had suffered terribly and was in an agony I couldn't imagine, and he looked at me and indicated he wanted to go, he wanted to leave, he wanted to be free of that suffering. Had somebody entered in there and said, "No, Hank, you can't go. We're going to keep you here because we think that's best," I would have been supremely offended. I aided him in his freedom from pain in that moment of time, supported him completely, and I wouldn't have wanted anyone to impose themselves there. And that's what I saw us doing on a systematic, methodical, and very grand level. And it led to my change of heart and mind. I'm going to be honest, I don't celebrate a woman, value it. I think it indicates some measure of loss somewhere, but that's my opinion. And my opinion may not matter, and it most certainly matters for the woman who is making that decision to abort a pregnancy, to continue it. And I want to honor that. And that has to do with affirming personhood for me.
Thank you so much. I want to say I've had so many wow moments in this conversation that it makes me almost hopeful for a route forward, which is what most of the audience questions, and tons of them are streaming in. We're going to turn to them now, and the wonderful folks behind the screen at Safra Center are helping us group them so that we get themes. Most of our questions are about ways forward. So first, a question that circles back to something Monica said about the role of the media in shaping public understanding on this issue. I think everybody on the call has heard opinions and expertise that is more nuanced and more subtle than a lot of what we're getting in other places. Thoughts about the role of media and how we can be better witnesses if a goal is to move us forward beyond stuck places. And here in this civil disagreement space, there is a lot of room for agreement and coalition building, even across chasms of belief. So what's media doing, and what are your best moves to undo, redo it, make a different kind of space? And Dan, since you gave your time back on the question of abortion as a positive good, let's start with you, and people can jump in as they will.
Sure. Well, I think media does shape people's views on the question. So I think we saw that this summer in the aftermath of Dobbs, after the stories came out about young girls who had been raped, having to travel across state lines to get abortions, or women who were attempting to get medical treatment for miscarriage, being denied that treatment, or the treatment being delayed. I think there's pretty good evidence that shifted people's views on the issue. And so in some conservative states, starting in Kansas, but then most recently in Kentucky, abortion prohibition referendums or something that would at least move toward that failed at the polls. And similarly, if we go back 50 years to 1972, the pro-life movement had an unexpected victory in Michigan when there was a referendum on the ballot to legalize abortion up through the 20th week of pregnancy. And the pro-life movement began distributing photos of 19-week-old fetuses, and that changed enough people's minds to cause the referendum to be defeated. So it's certainly the case that images change people's minds, media coverage changes people's minds. I think one of the things that we have to look at when we look at media is this question of, is there another side of the story? Are there things that are not being revealed in this? Or it's easy to get swayed by a powerful story or a powerful image. And then the question is, are there other sources of information? I think of course, there are other sources of information that we can access. It's just if we're used to tuning into one particular viewpoint, one particular channel, then we may not always get those perspectives.
Monica, it looks like you're trying to jump in, but you're muted.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if it was my turn or not, but yeah, media is going to do what media does. They need the money, they need the ads, they need the ratings. That's how they operate. And they are the ones that are supposed to have their pulse on, what's going on. When we look at media today is totally different than media back in the day. This media is a very aggressive media, and this media also doesn't have rules. Like there's sometimes no professionalism at all. Sometimes the information is, we'll see a murder at 5 o'clock, 10 people are murdered, and then later on in the day, oh, there were only 2. So sometimes it's sensationalized and it's hyped up. And in this day and age, anybody can be media. That's why we have social media. It's a conversation, and I'm sharing, the way I feel or what I think or what my thoughts are. The unfortunate thing about that is you have a lot of bullies out here. You've got individuals that are hiding behind their thoughts, hiding behind what's real. And I know I just got elected for my 3rd term as commissioner, and the Catholic Association came to me and asked me if I would do a video on being a pro-life Democrat. And I told them, I said, I could potentially get primaried. I could potentially have someone from the party that wants to run against me. Yeah, let's do it. Exactly what I said. Yeah, let's do it. You know why? Because it's the truth. I'm standing on my truth. And if I'm the president of Democrats for Life of America. And if I cannot stand on anything that is true to me, then I don't deserve to be the president of any organization. If I'm going to cower down, if I'm going to be a coward and go somewhere for the benefit of myself instead of working for the people. That's what the job is, working for the people, whether they agree with me, disagree, or whatever. There's so many more things that we can agree upon than what we can disagree on. So I just don't think that the role of media will ever go away, because media is there to inform us. It's just, what are you listening to and who's your source? So I don't take advice from individuals that I don't trust the thoughts or the process of individuals I wouldn't take advice from, that they have no credibility with me. So I would admonish everyone else to do the same thing. Don't just be a sheeple. Don't just follow whatever, the emotions are that go with media. Try to figure out the facts. Try to figure out the way that you're feeling. But even at that, you're going to do that based on your own experience. So you and I are not going to have the same thought process because we don't have the same experience. I'm a Black woman. you're beautiful, a woman with beautiful silver hair. So, so we're not going to have the same experiences, and that's okay. But let's use those experiences to learn from each other. So media, I love it, but I hate it at the same time.
Thanks. I'm going to move on to another question and start out with Rob, who needs the special hand up because we can't take any visual cues from him at all at this point. So an audience member has written, and I'll read this out because it sort of contradicts some of what we've been praising so far. It's certainly refreshing to hear such nuanced and subtle opinions, and yet it is not clear that the subtlety and nuance with which your disagreement is framed makes the disagreement any less fundamental. This questioner is curious about the panelists' thoughts on the utility of subtlety and nuance around this issue. Are we nuancing ourselves to a better place or a worse place? And Rob, let's start with you there and see who else wants to jump in.
Wow. Well, thank you for giving me the advantage, given my disadvantage here with technology. That's a very important question. I guess I'm enough of an optimist and pragmatist to think that if we can honor and be patient and accept a level of nuance and stay with it long enough, that we'll discover more points where our agreement is concrete. The other thing is, for me, I know that in my own journey of change, I had to take a position of humility. My formation as an evangelical, later as a minister, certainly.
Rob has now become so humble that we've lost his voice. Are you still there? All right, I wrote down humility because that ought to be a watchword in all of our existential disagreements. Does anyone else want to speak to the question of nuance? And then I want to ask an audience member's question about its opposite.
I just want to say really quickly, and reiterate this, most people are not at the extremes. Right? Most people are willing to have conversations. I mean, Dan was talking about a 10-year-old who's pregnant, right? A lot of us are going to agree that that is not a good thing, right? And that is a situation in which a termination is appropriate. An ectopic pregnancy, right? I mean, there are lots of different places where I think we can have those discussions. And so I think part of what being willing to engage in these discussions with humility, but also, being willing to say that having a position where there is no give whatsoever, wherever you are on the spectrum, is problematic. Right. And so as we think of ourselves now in this sort of legislative moment, maybe I'm not gonna sign up for an abortion ban, but I might have a conversation and a fight with you about, well, what should the exceptions be? Right. Because I still want to engage in that conversation with you. So I do think that there is value in it. And particularly there is value in coming to the table, not assuming that everybody else is coming there in bad faith.
Thank you, and thank you for all exemplifying that willingness. This came in as a question for Dan, but I think it speaks, I'll let him start with it, but I think it speaks to breadcrumbs that all the panelists have dropped, which is that you've spoken about a skepticism for what I would label increasingly carceral impulses in the pro-life movement, a skepticism about legal and political and punitive measures for accomplishing those goals that that you found in a sort of purer and healthier form in the pre-Roe part of the movement. So what else we got, right? Like if we're skeptical about law and politics and media and punishment, what are the better methods in this questioner's curiosity for the pro-life movement to employ? But I think we could productively apply the question to the repro justice and repro rights frames as well. So are people less convinced about legal, political, and carceral mechanisms? And if so, what would you like to see us turn to? Let's start with Dan, Monica, Rob, and Kim, and that should take us to about time if we're economical in our response.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think there are quite a few different ways that we could try to reduce the abortion rate. During the 1970s, a substantial number of people in the pro-life movement favored an expanded social welfare state that would offer more support for women facing crisis pregnancies. Recently, that some pro-lifers like Charlie Camosi have been very vocal about supporting expanded parental leave, paid daycare, basically other forms of support that would make it easier for people to choose voluntarily to carry a pregnancy to term, I think could reduce the abortion rate. Kim mentioned quite a few minutes ago a statistic that is absolutely correct, which is that 60% of people who have abortions are already parents. And if that's the case, actually, there's another statistic that I don't have in front of me, but there have been polls taken, surveys of women at abortion clinics asking, check the boxes as to why you're here today to have an abortion. And a substantial number, roughly half, we could say, cite economic reasons as a contributing factor. And so I think there's reason to believe that a significant number, definitely not 100%, but a significant number of women who come to an abortion provider would prefer to have some other options if those were available. That they would prefer to be in other life circumstances. And so that could be one way to reduce the abortion rate. I think the legal approach that the pro-life movement is taking today is in some ways a very recent invention. The pro-life movement always favored laws against abortion. In fact, when the pro-life movement started in the 1960s, it was dealing with a situation in which those laws had already been on the books, in most cases for about 80 years. And so they wanted to preserve those laws. But the laws that they wanted to preserve are not the same type of punitive laws that are being passed today. So when Alabama, for example, passed an abortion ban in 2019 that then went into force last summer, it potentially provided for imprisonment of abortion providers up to 99 years. The pre-Roe abortion bans were rarely, if ever, like that. They tended to have penalties of maybe 5 to 7 years for a doctor, and they were not often enforced, at least against medical professionals. Unlicensed providers could end up in jail, but licensed medical professionals rarely experienced that, whereas I think we're in a very different political moment. So that's something to keep in mind, that the current political approach that's adopted is something that I think represents political changes that occurred starting in the Reagan era and beyond that would not necessarily reflect the pre-Roe environment. And there are some pro-lifers who would prefer to go back to an earlier model, who prefer to think about alternative methods of encouraging reductions in the abortion rate.
I'm conscious of time. I would love to get you each on this question very quickly. So Monica, what's your best ally if we're skeptical of media and law? And then Rob, and then Kim close us out.
I say that we listen to the women and the men, because it's not just only about women. Listen to the people that want to be parents to this degree. Make sure that we have some social justice programs, make sure that we have programs, environmental justice, make sure that we have, insurance, for crying out loud, for everyone. Make sure that we are doing everything we can to support those that do want to be parents. I'm going to say it again. Not everyone wants to be a parent, and that is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But to do what your body was intended to do, don't make a crime. Don't make it seem like, it's the worst thing in the world to want to be a parent. So I think that it's on us to listen and keep having these conversations, not so we can change minds, but so that we can understand the full scope of everything that we're dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
Oh, sorry.
The reason I think that this question should not be given to political actors to attempt to resolve, if they can even get close to that, is because it will be exploited. And that means all the human beings involved, including the unborn human being, will be exploited for political gain. I saw it happen in our movement. I started out the way Dan described, and by the end of it, we had made deals with gun manufacturers. We had made deals with cynical political actors who said, once we give you the downfall of Roe v. Wade, and this was said literally to me by Republican Party leaders, once we give you the downfall of Roe, you won't be able to turn to anybody else. So you take the whole enchilada. You either take the whole package or you take none, and you don't get Roe's downfall. That was the deal we made as a movement. So when you surrender this to political actors, those political forces will exploit every human being in the equation. I think it belongs in the moral and social justice realm, and that's where it should be. And that's why I supported Roe in the end, and that's why I dissented on the Dobbs decision, Roe's downfall.
Thank you, Rob, and Kim, take us out.
Yeah, so I'll be really quick here. I mean, first, I think I want to really agree with what both Monica and Dan said, right? That this is a moment for us to, and particularly for people who are pro-life, to say that's not just about a fetus, right? That's about a child in the world. And what do we do to support families? And what do we do to support people once they do actually have children? But I think on the other side of that, this is also a moment for us to really recognize that too much of what we talk about in the context of abortion is really shaming people for sex, right? That's a consequence. If you have sex and you get pregnant, well, then you just have to, grin and bear it. I'm not sure I ever think that a child should feel like a punishment. So I think we want to be really careful about that. So this is also a time for us to, make sure that we don't start treating every form of contraception as though it is also an abortion, right? So morning after pills, IUDs, and we're already seeing, attacks on some of those forms of contraception. This is a moment for us to provide comprehensive sex education, right? So people understand, how you get pregnant and what the risks are there, right? As I said before, 50% of pregnancies in this country are unplanned. Doesn't mean unwanted, but they're unplanned. So we have a lot of work to do. And I think in the end, and the last thing that I want to say, just in terms of thinking about, where we're going to go in terms of incarceration. And I think we are going to shift to more women being punished for self-managed abortions in a world where we have medication abortion. If 60% of women who have babies, who have abortions, already have children at home, what happens when we put those women in prison? right? What happens to their children? What happens when they can no longer get public housing because they have a conviction? What happens when their kids end up in our child welfare system, right? What happens when they can't get a job because they have criminal convictions? So, you know, I think there's a lot that we could be doing in this moment that isn't just about let's ban abortion and that fixes all of our problems, because it doesn't.
Thank you all. I want to turn back to my colleague Danielle Allen, and in gratitude to all of you for a wonderful discussion.
And Jane, we are all in debt to you for such deft moderation. Thank you. And to all of the panelists, Daniel, Monica, Kim, Rob, you've brought so much heart to this conversation. Your generosity is really extraordinary. And thank you so much for setting a model for all of our students and all of our community for thoughtfulness and care for others, both in this conversation and obviously more broadly in your worlds. Your care and commitment to the people around you, for all of you, just comes through so powerfully. And that's the most profound lesson, I think, in this conversation. It's the kind of care that we do all need to bring to these most challenging of questions. So I also really want to thank the Safford Center team, Emily Bromley, Jess Miner, Alex Ostrowski-Schilling. They have worked so hard to establish this conversation, make this possible, and just really, really proud of your leadership team on this. Ashley and Judith, thank you very much for making this conversation more broadly accessible. You've given us all so much to think about. I think, you know, I was sitting in a viewing room as a part of this conversation. There were a lot of emotions rippling through the room throughout the conversation. You could see lots of light bulb moments, lots of a sense of taking in and settling. And I think you've given us all space for a new kind of conversation. So I leave this with a great sense of hopefulness, in fact. So thank you again very much for being here with us this evening. Good night.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Be well.